Welcome each one of you to this hour of worship, and trust that as we worship together today, we will sense God's presence in very real and powerful ways. As far as announcements, I know of one that has changed. We're moving the graduation recognition up to next Sunday, and that is in the good hands of people other than me. I'm going to confess, I started a family discussion by reminding my two sisters and my brother that I am the eldest son. And according to the Old Testament, there are certain rights that should be affirmed for me. And that I didn't notice them bowing down when I came in, and all other sorts of things. Even an attempted humor did not bring humor to that part of my family. What happens when we demand our rights? Now, I'm not saying that our rights are not important, and I'm not talking about other people's rights and all that. But what happens when you demand your rights? Sometimes we need to do it. But many times we're in for an interesting time when we do. What rights do we have as a Christian? Greg said we had a long reading today. We only had about 1/10 of what should have been read. We need to read the whole 8th chapter and 9th chapter of Corinthians. That church was in some confusion and turmoil. And I might argue that every church should be in that kind of turmoil some of the time, because it shows there was life and there was vitality and all that was going on. And sometimes as a pastor, I try so hard to let's all be of one mind and everything, when in reality, sometimes the getting pushed on the edges help us tremendously. But that's another sermon, and we'll go there some other day. Before you can have your rights, you've got to prove your credentials. I worked at United Parcel Service when I was in seminary, from 11:30 at night to 2:30 in the morning. I made more money in those 15 hours a week than my wife did working 40 hours a week. And you know why? Because I was a member of the Teamsters Union, and I had a card to prove it. Now, the card said there were certain things that the boss couldn't do and all that, and those oftentimes got overlooked. But I had credentials. What credentials do you have that allows you to demand your rights as a Christian? Paul said, I was the one that started this church. I was the one who saw Christ. He's undoubtedly referring to his conversion experience. And he said, I have been your leader, and that gives me some right to speak. There's probably some truth in that. What about our credentials? We can talk about our relationship with Christ. We can talk about our experience of grace. We could talk about how long we've been involved in the life of the church, and all of those things will bring us something. But now that I have the credentials, what about my rights? The book of Corinthians shares a problem that the church at Corinth had. They were divided over a number of things. One of the things was around the pastor. And lots of times you have reason to question the rights of a pastor. And I'm not here to defend all pastors, and even to defend myself. But the conflict then was over whether Paul should be just preaching or he should be working in his tent-making business. And there was people on both sides, and there was some conflict. And he seemed to say, you don't want to mess with me. We're going to get in a fight over this, and I'm going to tell you why I'm right. And Paul was the kind of person you didn't want to go up against in a debate. He was strong, he was forceful, he was energetic. And he laid all of that out and said, that a farmer gets the grain off of their plant, and I should be able to be taken care of, and all of the things that went with that. We're going to leave that for some other pastor to preach. I'm not going to touch that one here. But the other issue was about eating meat. I got friends that are vegetarians. I would probably be healthier if I was, at least they tell me that. But this is not about being a vegetarian. There was a problem in Corinth. You could only buy meat from certain meat markets. I mean, all of them were in like a club or a union or something like that. But what had happened was one of the false temples and their priests would come and pray over all the animals as they were being killed. And then he would get a cut for the temple, and it was a real good gig for some of those false prophets. Now, in the church, the issue was, I can't eat meat that's been offered to an idol, because that's a false idol. Some people believe that. And others, like Paul, said, hey, we know that God that they're worshiping, there's just nothing to him. He's just a stone image, and we know it's a good gig for the union and all that they've got. So, I'm not going to let that get in my way, and I'm not going to let that keep me from eating meat. But the other group said, you may be right, Paul, but every time I bite into that steak, I think of how that false religion had me hooked in, and I just can't get it out of my mind. And it gets in the way of my Christian faith and all that goes with it. And I don't know how to deal with this. And Paul said, those idols are worthless. They do not have any sway over you or your soul. But that was not the end of it. Because we know that in our heart there are issues around it. Paul makes his argument so strong. And then right in the middle of that strong argument, he says in the 12th verse, we have rights. And he went back to delineate those rights. But I will put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel. So eating the meat was not going to be an issue for him. He in effect was saying, I would rather not eat meat so I don't have to spend my time defending myself when I could be out sharing the reality of the gospel. Paul talks in the 8th chapter about the weaker brother, the one that is new in Christ, the one that doesn't have the understanding or the depth of faith that Paul has. But Paul argues, I have that right. And the priests are abusing it and all that goes with it. Paul then talks about the analogy of the race. The Isthmian Games were held there in Corinth. And they were athletic endeavors. And Paul says, I don't box as if I'm shadow boxing. I prepare my body for a real fight. And I prepare my body so I can run. And people there, they say, were as enthused about athletics as many of us are today. And he would hold on to that image of an athlete preparing themselves. But Paul continued to say, in the words of Dr. Barclay, that a pleasure or an indulgence which may be the ruin of someone else is not a pleasure for me, but a sin. He was saying that, it doesn't seem to make any sense. I don't want to cause someone to think less of the gospel because of that. My roommate, John, was a cross-country runner. We roomed together for 3 years. John was a very bright idiot. He went on to pastor a very large church and a person of deep faith. But I could never understand his singular focus on cross country. John was a short little guy, not much to him, but he could run all day and not get tired. I got tired of the alarm going off at 5:45. Not in the morning, not for cross-country practice, but for his own personal practice. Cross-country practice was at 4 o'clock, and they would run hills or 6 or 7 miles or sprints. 5:45 was his 6 o'clock in the morning call to go out and just do a quick 5 miles. I never quite could grasp that. But that was John. His junior year, the last year that he was able to run in college, as he got in a car accident, but that's another story. It was the first of January, felt like January, 1st of November, first few days of November in northern Wisconsin, or northern Indiana. And I went to the last cross-country meet, the conference meet, at a golf course. And Indiana at that time of the year can be anywhere from 60 degrees to closer to 20. It was much closer to 20 on this day. The wind was blowing 20 miles an hour, more out of the northwest. There was a little bit of rain and sleet coming with it. There was, it was dark and overcast, and they were getting ready to run. I found myself a place on a hill where I could see where the starting and finish line was, about 100 yards this way, and I could see 3 different places where they would come through, and I could see how John was doing. About 10 minutes before the stated start of the race, they all got together with the officials and told them what the rules were, which they already knew, and then they went back to their individual teams. After a rah-rah thing from the coach, I saw John go off to the side. And he at that time was dressed with a stocking cap, gloves, sweatpants, a heavy sweatshirt, hooded sweatshirt. And I saw him walk off to the side by a tree and where there was a friend of his closer to him. And he took off his stocking cap and put it down. And he took off his gloves, his thick, warm gloves, and put them down. And he took off his sweatpants. And I thought, you can't be going to run just in regular 90-degree shorts. But he took off those sweatpants and threw them down. And then I saw him take off his hooded sweatshirt. And I thought, well, at least he's got the good sense to keep his windbreaker on that was underneath it. But no, he didn't. And he took it off. Now, I was 100 yards away with a parka, with gloves, with a stocking cap, wishing I had winter boots on rather than just tennis shoes, and not giving too much thought to John. The gun started and they ran. And I could see John staying with the leaders, and I could see him at the 1 mile turn, and I could see him a couple miles later, and I could see him as he was coming down at the end. He was with the last pack and ran his best, and certainly was all conference. And I met him at the finish, after the finish line. I had a big blanket, threw it around him, congratulated him, but I said, John, you're a fool. Why didn't you leave that windbreaker on? And he was huffing and puffing like someone who had just run 5-point-something miles that they did in college for cross country. And he looked at me and he said, I wasn't running to keep warm. I was running to win. When I think of the Gospels, I bring that analogy to Jesus. How many times, if we would have been in his sandals, would we have said, oh, you disciples just don't have it. I can't take it anymore. We're done. Mm-hmm. How many times would Jesus be taken to the edge? But he wasn't. He wasn't. How many times could he have just said, even right before the cross, it's been a good run, but people aren't getting it. I'm done. But he didn't. Because he, like John, was running not to stay warm, but to accomplish a goal. Mm-hmm. How are we running our Christian faith? I'm not saying we need to be the doormat for the whole world. But how many times do my demanding my rights get in the way of running the race? How are we running? Are we running to keep warm, or are we running to win? To God be the glory. Amen.